His stool looked more like a throne the way he sat on it, and he kept throwing them back to the general rapture of the onlookers. He was middle-aged, late 40s by his look, and his body was beginning to run into the zone of comfortable fat that seemed the providence of men on the cusp of old age. He'd come here every night for the last week, and for the last week, I'd come here to observe him. I knew his name, which was a rarity. Most of them were just part of the faceless mass. Some of them would remain faceless forever, but some of them were known to me before the end. I was their shadow, the one who knew their secrets, and the one who ushered them from life to death. At that moment, I remembered my first. They say you never forget your first, and I can assure you that's the case. How could I forget her? She ushered me into the world of the living, so it was only fair that I usher her into the world of the dead. My mother was not what you would call a loving woman. My father left shortly after my birth, and my mother became a hateful, gin-soaked creature who lived to work, drink, and remind me of how worthless I was. I must thank her one day. She made me into the man I am. All those years of being told how I was garbage, the waste of space, and now I'd never amount to anything, had crafted me into a humble target for her to hurl her rage at, until that one night when I'd finally had enough. She was dying. That was plain enough to see. It was a close race between the booze and the smokes to see who could come out on top. The arthritis was making a nuisance of itself as usual, and as I cut her meat, she continued to pick at my subconscious like a junkie picking at scabs. The meat wasn't cut small enough. Now it was cut too small. It was a funny shape, and what could she expect from a worthless pile of shit like me after all? She was ashamed of her weak, servile son, and if there was any justice in this world. But you know, I never found out what would happen if there was any justice in this world. At that moment, I had suffered all I meant to. I yelled for her to shut up, and I stuck the knife I'd been using to cut her meat into her chest. She looked up at me, and her eyes were so full of terror and wonder that I put the knife back in again. I'd stabbed her 5 times before she made a sound, and even that was unintelligible. A gurgling, incoherent sound that befit a formless hag like my mother, hand in glove. I moved her body and told the police she had come home drunk and attacked me. They let me collect her estate, such as it was, and I moved on. The only thing worthwhile that I ever had from her was the knowledge that I was good for at least one thing. He got up from the stool, and I tensed as I came out of my memories. He took a step for the door, but then changed his mind and walked to the bathroom instead. I settled myself and waved the waitress away when she starts to check on me. This was not the dying place I had planned for him, but I could feel his time getting close. I used the money I'd gotten from my mother's estates to travel. When I say travel, you probably think of planes or buses, but my mother's estate had mostly come in unpaid bills. $50 in a savings account, another $500 she'd hidden in the bookcase and forgotten about, and $1,500 in a life insurance policy I'd never known existed. I sold all the possessions she had left her debts unsettled, and melted into the exciting world of public vagrancy. I rode the rails, slept under bridges, and all the time I kept honing my craft. I killed a bum in New York that was found in a river later, his pockets holding $500 and a dirty picture of a woman. Then I found a junkie in Jersey, who I later found out had a wife and kids he'd been hiding his drug problem from. Then 2 prostitutes in Queens who had been sharing the same man without knowing it, and all the while me staying one step ahead of the authorities. The investigations weren't lengthy. These were street people, or people up to no good, and their investigations were forgettable. The one to matter since my mother was number 5. Number 5, we'll call him James, was a New York businessman with a dark secret than the money he laundered from the mob. I was back home for the first time in years when I bumped into James purely by mistake. Coming out of a bus station, he plowed into me on the sidewalk and barked at me to look where the hell I was going. Some people would have killed him right then and there, but that wasn't my way. The stalk was the biggest thrill for me. Soon I discovered that James had a little secret of his own. He used to pick up whores late at night in his fancy red sports car. He liked to take them to the docks, and after a little backseat back and forth, he would drug them and sell them to people who would pay top dollar for good stock. These weren't mobsters either. These were men who could afford to make sure these women disappeared. Afterwards, he'd get high in his car and zone out as he thought his bleak thoughts had mellowed. He'd come back to reality pretty quick when I slid the knife across his throat. His eyes rolled up as I told him how bad he'd been as his life dribbled out down his cheap suit. The police found enough evidence in his briefcase to follow the paper trail, but I was long gone by then. My latest quarry returned from the bathroom and staggered towards the door again. After bumping into a few tables and accepting the scornful shouts and hard shoves from the patrons, he found the door and wrapped his hand around the handle. I started to rise, and then his friends called to him from the door, offering him just one more for the road. "Well, how can I say no to such a generous offer?" he asked, and wandered back to the bar for one more drink. Killing this one would be doing him a favor, just like number 18. Number 18. Anna had been sweet enough to make me think about giving it all up and living a normal life. Too bad life is rarely that easy. During my travels, I caught pneumonia and was hospitalized for nearly a week. Anna was my nurse. She was the sweetest person I'd ever met, and after bringing me back from the brink of death, she found out I was homeless and wandering and invited me to stay with her until I could get back on my feet. I stayed with her for nearly a year, and the two of us became closer than we'd expected. In that year, I never once felt the urge to kill. We'd been planning our wedding when they diagnosed her with cancer. As she underwent chemotherapy, tried new diet after miracle cure, after experimental treatment, I went back to my old respite. That year, Chicago was hit by a serial killer. 9 victims in 9 months, but my 10th victim was the only one that mattered. On her deathbed, Anna told me she knew I was the killer. She'd followed me one night, putting her own health at risk. She said she had been certain I wasn't cheating on her. She saw me stab a man and push him into the canal. She was tired of living, tired of the pain, and she asked me to be her mercy angel. I gave her what she wanted. By the time the air bubble in her IV killed her, I was already gone. One for the road turned out to be more like 5. When my prey finally shuffled towards the door, I was there to hold it open for him. He thanked me in a slurry voice and stumbled out into the night, the king of the inebriates. I followed after him like a hungry wraith, and when he turned down an alley, I knew his time had come. I tucked my knife up in my sleeve and began to creep up behind him as I moved to the end of the alley. I heard his zipper go down, and as he sent a stream of piss arcing across the bricks, I stalked in quietly behind him. North Carolina was not my desired destination, but I'd enjoyed the 3 years I'd been here. After Anna, I was drunk more than I was sober. Beer when I had money, hobo brew when I didn't, and always I rode the rails from one place to another. I picked up work in Maine and drank my way to Philadelphia, sloshed my way back to Chicago, where I somehow drank my way into a drunk tank in Warren, North Carolina. After my release, I worked odd jobs for odd folks. I landed a steady gig as a day cook in a little greasy spoon diner, and only felt the urge to kill a few times. The people in Warren were good people, and the people I killed were bad people, people who had tainted that image. A rapist I knew from my days on the rails who blew into town and started doing his own stalking. A foul-mouthed drunk who kept driving after they took his license. A woman with a taste for married men. And finally, Mr. Ham here, number 23. Mr. Ham, though, he was the worst of the bunch. He hated the homeless with a passion, and I suspected that he had killed some of my fellow rail riders for imagined crimes. I had watched him for a week, marked his movements carefully, and now it was time to see him put away for good. I raised the knife as I came up behind him and prepared for the strike that would take him while he urinated. That's when he turned, and his arc of piss hit me full in the face. I stumbled backwards, momentarily blinded, and a solid blow took me to my knees. I toppled, legs hurting, and a heavy right struck me in the chest as I flailed to get back up. I wiped at my eyes, and there was Ham, towering over me. He was no longer looking quite so drunk. Perched on my chest like the world's ugliest gargoyle, he smiled down at me, looking like the cat that finally got the cream. "I knew you were watching me all this time, so I thought I'd see what your intentions were. I suspected you were trying to kill me. Kind calls to kind, after all. But I do have one question before I kill you." The tip of my own knife pressed against my throat. "How many lives have you counted?" I didn't have to ask what he meant. You would have been 23. He leaned in, wishing to impart a secret before the end, and whispered, "You will be my 44th.
When the box arrived, Emily was thrilled. She'd been waiting for this particular package since March, and at long last it was here. Emily had been trying to get into one of these cold case box services for a while. Hunt-A-Killer, Cold Case, Sleuth Kings, she'd requested them all, but all Emily got back were apology letters and promises that they would contact her when they had room. The folks at Catch-A-Killer had placed her on their tentative waiting list, which sometimes took months, and she hadn't expected to be added to the list for quite some time. It was hard to get added. They only approved a few hundred people a year, and they were also one of the more popular groups. The service was their typical monthly subscription box, where they sent a cold case that the small group you found yourself to be a part of tried to solve. They would send clues a few at a time, a slow drip of evidence that would lead the group to the end conclusion, and they would follow the trail to a predictable end. As she brought the box inside, Emily felt giddy with anticipation. However, some of it was tempered when she stopped to look at the box. The label said "To Catch a Killer," but the address label was torn off, and the box looked a little bit funny. If this was their way of creating ambience, then Emily felt they'd done a great job. The box was battered and dirty, the clear tape around it looking thick and yellow, and the letters were pieced together out of newspaper clippings. It was a nice touch, if not a little cliché. The letter inside was no exception. The whole thing was made of magazine and newspaper letters, meticulously assembled by hand. At least, it appeared as such. Emily couldn't imagine how much time this had taken whoever had put it together, especially if they had to build more than a few of them. Emily had to applaud their commitment, but it wasn't something that seemed feasible long term. She would be surprised if this level of detail persisted, and took the note out of the box so she could read it. This is the case of the West End Tooth Fairy. He has a kill count of around 26, and was most prominent between 2019 and 2022. His first victim was Miss Mary Klein, a retired teacher who lived alone. It took the police almost 4 years to place her as his victim, only then because his pattern began to surface. She was stabbed 15 times, most of them in the chest, and a smile was carved across her mouth from ear to ear. No forensic evidence was discovered at the scene, no sign of forced entry, and she was left in her favorite chair in the living room. No one was charged with her death, and only one item was ever reported missing from the victim: the bottom and top plate of her dentures. Emily read it over a few times, but couldn't figure out what she was supposed to be looking for. This was less of a case file and more of a story. Emily had read a few articles about how the information was disseminated, and then picked over by the community, but this read more like a creepypasta. She wondered if this might be one of those things where a group member got a different piece of the puzzle, but that was another point of confusion as she looked through the box. As she looked, Emily saw a plastic baggie with a pair of pliers inside. She took them out hesitantly, the red around the teeth of the pliers looking pretty convincing. Emily gave the box a once-over, finding them a pretty good prop for the price of the box service. Once the pliers and the note were out, though, the box was empty. There was no group code or information on getting up with the rest of your team, and after a thorough search, she found nothing. Emily shrugged, not too upset about it. They had probably just forgotten to add it, and she figured that a quick trip to the internet would get her in contact with her group. She was still excited about her quick admittance to the group, and hopped on the site to see what she could find. A little while later, Emily closed her laptop with a huff of frustration. She had checked every group, but no one was following the Tooth Fairy case. No one seemed to know what she was talking about either, and it was starting to make her wonder. Maybe the others would sign up soon. Maybe she had gotten her box a little too early. In the end, she set up a room for the Tooth Fairy case, figuring the others would find her, and decided to go to bed. She'd sign on tomorrow and find that they had discovered her, and then the game could begin. Instead, she woke up to find another dodgy package on her front porch, and only a few messages in the room she had started, none of them helpful. The people who had found the room appeared to have used her post as an excuse to belittle her. The 3 or 4 users who had left comments were quick to remark that the Tooth Fairy case was little more than an urban legend, not likely to be something Catch-a-Killer would tackle. They made fun of her for even suggesting that they received a case file on this one, and decided that she must be trolling. Today's box looked like it had gotten wet, and the cardboard was dark and distorted. Emily huffed and deleted their comments, setting the box on the table as she cleared her own inbox. This was what she got for asking for help on the internet. Most of these people were just shut-ins with little more to do than bother her, and she knew she shouldn't take it personally. Even so, Emily reflected that it was frustrating that none of the others who'd received the case files had hopped in to share information. As she sat grumbling at the computer screen, she found her eyes straying to the box and finally decided to open it. The material felt as damp as she'd expected, but that only added to the mystery. It hadn't rained last night, or for the last few days, and she couldn't believe that anyone would have delivered a package in such condition. And why was it here so early? It was near noon, but the mail didn't usually run until 2 or 3 in the afternoon. The box had been waiting for her when she opened the door, leading her to believe that it had been dropped off much earlier. Inside the box was another of those strange notes, the letter made of magazine clippings, and an envelope that she thought might contain pictures. His next victims were the Hughes children, Mary, Shelley, and Clark, ages 12, 10, and 8, respectively. Coming in through the window in their bedroom, he tied them up and made them watch as he stabbed them to death from oldest to youngest. Each of them was stabbed 20 to 30 times. Their parents found them the next morning, both having slept through the night as their children died mere feet away. The oldest child was found to have her lower canines removed, the middle child her bottom incisors, and the youngest was missing his bottom premolars. The teeth were believed to have been taken as a trophy, and that was when the police began calling him the Tooth Fairy, though the press wouldn't start using it until much later. As she took out the pictures, Emily felt her blood run cold as she flipped the top back. There were 12 pictures inside, all seemingly taken with a Polaroid camera. All of them were of crying children, their hands tied behind them and their mouths stuffed with whatever they had at hand. The girls appeared to be older than the brother, all of them bearing the same sandy hair and hazel eyes. And as the pictures carried on, Emily could see the fearful children becoming broken children. Their pajamas reddened, their wounds seeming to grow with each snapshot, and by the end, all 3 were lying on the carpet together. As their blood seeped into the thick shag, Emily felt the pictures slip from her numb fingers. What was this? It was a little too much if this was someone's idea of a joke or a game. She had wanted to be part of this game, but if this was the level they were playing at, she wasn't sure she was up to it. These Polaroids looked real, like something taken instead of made, and as Emily held them, they felt dirty in her hands. She put them in the box and picked up her computer as she tried to discover anything about the case that she was being drip-fed. This was the second box she'd received that felt more like a love letter to the killer and less like a case file. There were no clues to follow, no breadcrumbs to lead her to an outcome, just harrowing stories to listen to that ultimately didn't tell her anything. If this was how it was, she really needed to see if anyone else had received the clues she was failing to find. The forum offered more veiled insults, and Emily huffed as she closed the laptop. With no words from the admin and no help forthcoming from her fellow investigators, she couldn't do much but speculate. In the end, she dumped the contents of the box into the first one and threw the new box away. When her eyes kept darting over to it as it sat on the top layer of the garbage can, she pulled it out and took it to the outside garbage. She couldn't stand the way it seemed to be watching her, and as she came back up the front steps of the porch, she stopped in her tracks as she saw the last thing she expected to see. Another cardboard box, covered in old yellow tape, was on her welcome mat, sitting like a steaming pile of fresh foreboding. Emily looked around, suddenly not feeling so safe standing in front of her own house. How had she missed it? It hadn't just appeared between her leaving her front door and putting the box in the garbage can. It had taken a matter of minutes, 2 or 3 at the most, and someone would have had to place the box quickly and quietly in order to get it here in the interim. Someone like a serial killer who stole people's teeth and kept them as trophies. Emily shook the thought off and reached down to pick up the box. She must have just missed it on the way out, must have stepped right over it, but that didn't stop her from locking the deadbolt and throwing the chain across the door. She took the box to the dining room table, but it would be quite a while before she found the courage to open it. She looked at it as she cleaned her house, returning to it a few times throughout the day. She didn't want to open it, was honestly afraid of what might be in it, but it still hung over her like an omen. As fearful as she was, it was a very tantalizing mystery, and Emily loved a good mystery. As the sun went down and the shadows grew tall in her living room, Emily was helpless to stop herself from ripping off the tape. The box had the same wet, warped look the other one had borne, and as the tape came off, Emily was greeted by yet another handmade note and a long metal tool that made her grit her teeth. It was an ice pick, and someone had clearly used it roughly. The end was dented, the metal flowering up around the point of impact. The tip was malformed, that angry exclamation almost as damaged as the butt end, and it helped the red paint find its way into the porous metal that sought to drink it up. It worked its way into the crevices, and the dark red made the tool all the more grotesque. The fourth victim was Dr. Reynolds of the Norvis Free Clinic. Posing as a homeless man, he came in before operating hours and killed the good doctor before his staff could arrive. The Tooth Fairy had chosen Dr. Reynolds carefully, the two bearing a striking resemblance. It was easy for him to pose as Dr. Reynolds and continue to see patients. The next 12 victims were homeless people at the clinic, people he invited to come in after hours. The cause of death for all was the same as Dr. Reynolds, a single puncture wound to the side of the neck. From these victims, the Tooth Fairy completed his collection of bottom teeth. She added the pick to the box of other things before slipping it into the hall closet and going to sit in her room. Suddenly, the living room was a little too open, the windows too exposed for Emily's taste. She sat in bed, trying not to think about the boxes or the mystery that surrounded them. The more of them she received, the more she had to remind herself that this was just something cooked up by the company. It became harder and harder to justify to herself, though, as the contents became more graphic. She had read a lot of forum posts before signing up, and none of this seemed like the experiences she had read about. The cases were spooky sometimes, but there was always a group of people to help you solve them. Doing this alone was making her anxious, and the clues weren't really pointing her towards a suspect at all. This was reading more like a story, and less like a case. She wasn't sure what to take away from this, besides the crawling anxiety that surrounded her. She checked the group again, and found nothing but more people making fun of her for suggesting Catch a Killer would cover anything like the Tooth Fairy case. It's not even real. It's an urban legend. No, it's real, but the group only handles cases with suspects and evidence. The killer never leaves anything behind. The case is too high profile to let a bunch of amateurs mess it up by stepping on what little evidence they have. It was pages of stuff like that, but nothing helpful. None of the admins had posted either, and Emily supposed they were on vacation. They couldn't weigh in on forum topics, they couldn't answer her questions, and it seemed like they couldn't be bothered to do much at all. Emily set her phone on the nightstand and got ready for bed again, deciding that she wouldn't open any more of the packages until someone else messaged the group to say that they'd received their packages. She needed help, she needed some perspective, and she wasn't going to get it in an echo chamber. As she fell asleep, she thought that at least it shouldn't be possible for them to send a fourth box so soon. It had probably been a fluke to send her 3 so close together, and she drifted off, hoping there might be someone to help her when the 4th arrived. She woke up the next morning to the sounds of birds and the gentle chime of her phone alarm. Emily felt a little better in the light of day, the megrims of the night before lost with the dawn filling her living room. She booted up her computer, intending to get some work done today before her boss called and complained about her lack of progress lately. First, however, she wanted breakfast. As the eggs and bacon sizzled in the pan, Emily felt all the anxiety of the night before dribbling away. She had made too much out of all this. She always psyched herself up so much over these things. Between the quarantine and working from home, she'd had too much time to mull over these dark corners. It might be time to get some of this under control. Maybe the box service was a little too much. She should cancel it and try again some other time. She had taken her phone out to do just that, her breakfast balanced on top of a cup of coffee, when something caught her eye in the peripheral. She was standing in the foyer, heading for the little office that she'd set up in the living room, when the spot found its way into her peripheral. She imagined that she could hear the tendons in her neck creaking as she turned her head to see if her fears were correct, and felt the plate wobble as the coffee shook in her hand. It couldn't be. It was 7 in the morning. The mail hadn't even thought about running yet. The package was sitting on the front porch, the center of her welcome mat, leering at her through the glass of the front door. She stood there for a count of 30, her mind whirling at the sight of the large brown box. But in the end, she didn't drop her food or dissolve into a puddle of terror. She turned away from the door and went to her desk. If she meant to continue buying box services, eggs, coffee, or paying the mortgage on her house, she needed to do some work. As she got to her tasks for the day, Emily found that her eyes just wouldn't stay off the package on the stoop. She couldn't see it from her desk. There was a wall in the way. But the mirror in the foyer gave her a perfect view of the front door. She had placed it there to see people when they came up, but now what appeared less than convenient. She tried to keep her mind on medical coding, but it was difficult with the non-existent eyes of the package on her. Her mind itched to see what was inside, little as she wanted to. It would be another horror show, she was certain, and it would be for her alone, since no one else seemed to be sharing it with her. Around 11, Emily finally sighed in frustration and pushed the keyboard away. She had done almost nothing in the 4 hours that she'd been working, and the sooner she got the package out of her mind, the better. She got up to go bring the package in, but as she moved into the foyer, she stopped again. There was a second package, sitting in the shadow of the first. She stared at it, her mind reeling as she pondered how it had gotten there. She'd had a perfect view of the door, There was no way that anyone could have snuck up and delivered a package in broad daylight without her seeing them. She stepped towards the door, feeling the tug of curiosity, but stopped as she saw the obvious answer. The second box was a little smaller than the other one. In her apprehension at the sight of the box, she had just overlooked the second one. That was it, just a failure to notice. The thought made her feel secure enough to turn away from the door and go make some lunch. She was coming back with her sandwich and a fresh cup of coffee when she looked again and saw a third box perched on top of the first. She'd been thinking that she might be able to get some work done, but seeing that third box, that dark brown cardboard monstrosity, she began to doubt the web of excuses that she had crafted. If they could sneak in a third box, they could have easily slipped in the second. If it hadn't been there, they had slipped in while she wasn't looking and delivered it without a sound. She returned to her computer long enough to find the contact information to catch a killer and called their customer service line. This was getting out of hand, and if no one was going to return her messages, then she'd just go to the source. Mazer Incorporated, this is Janet speaking. How may I direct your call? Emily wet her lips, not expecting such a quick response. She plowed on before the anger could cool, though. Yes, I'm trying to reach someone with catch-a-killer box service. This was the number they had listed online, and I... But the bubbly woman on the other end cut her off. Of course, 1 moment, please. 30 seconds of canned music later, and another far too happy young woman picked up the phone and asked Emily how she could help her. Yeah, I recently signed up for your service, but I think something's wrong. I've received at least 6 packages in the last 3 days, and it's always at random times. I can't seem to find anyone online that's part of the same group as me, and I think I'm getting parts of cases that require other parts to solve. The level of detail is really impressive on the boxes, but the volume is a little creepy. I think I'd either like to be put in another group or just cancel the service altogether, please. The woman then I seed through the whole conversation, and the background sound of keys clacking made Emily grit her teeth. I'm terribly sorry you're dissatisfied with our service, ma'am. You can absolutely have a refund, and I'll cancel your service. Feel free to keep the materials you've already received for your trouble. Do you know which case file you're assigned to? It's the Tooth Fairy case. The clicking abruptly stopped. You must be mistaken, ma'am. That's not a case we offer at this time. Not one we plan to offer in the future, either. Emily had been pacing, but stopped as the woman's words fell on her like a piano. That's the information I've been getting in the mail. All the boxes contain these little handmade letters and pictures and descriptions of murders. Let me get your information, ma'am. I'll see what group we have you assigned to. Emily gave her the info she'd filled in on the website, and after a few minutes of clicking, she could swear she heard the woman's teeth grinding together. I'm sorry, ma'am, but you aren't on our client list. You're on our tentative approval list, but we haven't taken your payment for the current cycle of case files. Emily stopped in the foyer, glancing fitfully out the front door as she tried to make sense of all of this. There was a 4th box on top of the other one, and as the golden afternoon set over the house, she felt a chill creep up her spine. What does that mean? She whispered, not daring to speak too loudly. It means that whoever's sending you those packages isn't anyone from our office. Emily was speechless, and as the woman called to her from the other end of the phone, she let it slip out of her hand and tumble to the hardwood. Emily wanted to call the police, but her curiosity was piqued. It was the same curiosity that had led her to sign up for the service in the first place, but now it had led her into a mystery that she hadn't been prepared for. As she wrapped her hand around the doorknob, she knew that there was no going back. If she looked in those boxes, if she cut the tape and saw what lay inside, she'd never be able to go back again. She opened the door, poking her head out like a groundhog from his hole. She expected something to be waiting out there for her, but the porch was empty except for the boxes. She juggled the 4 of them into her arms and brought them inside, closing the door and twisting the deadbolt before taking them to her bedroom. She left the phone in the foyer, taking all the boxes and locking herself behind her bedroom door. Spilling them onto her bed, she wondered what order she would open them in. Looking at them again, though, she realized each was numbered with a quick squirt of magic marker. Taking the largest, the one with the childish 4 on it, she strained a little at the weight of it. Something rumbled angrily inside, and as she slid her penknife over the tape, she was unsurprised to find a roofing hammer inside. Like the chisel, the head was spattered with a deep red stain, and the tines on the end were likewise painted. What had the 3rd box said? His victims had been killed by blunt force trauma to the base of the skull. After seeing the pictures of the children, she doubted he could contain himself from cutting and slicing them after the fact. He'd wanted to kill them quickly before they could give him away, but he still wanted the thrill of slicing them up. The note inside was quite illuminating. His next 3 victims were an odd fellow looking to have some teeth extracted, a census taker that he suspected might be working for the police, and the private detective that ultimately caused him to abandon the free clinic. The detective had a friend in the local police force, a friend whom he'd told before heading to investigate the rumors of missing people at the clinic. The tooth fairy avoided the raid meant to catch him and added 6 more teeth to his collection. From the old man, he took the front incisors. From the census taker, the 2 top incisors next to them. Finally, from the nosy investigator, he took the top canines and left on a bus as the police raided his hunting ground. She paused before opening the 5th. Had she heard a sound in the living room? She wanted to check, but the knife made such a satisfying sound on the tape as she opened it. Inside was a business card for someone named Carol Barner. The legend beneath proclaimed her to be a webmaster from Mazer Inc., and Emily suspected that she already knew what the note would tell her. How easy it had been for the packages to arrive at her house, almost like someone had her name and address. She thought again that she'd heard a noise from the living room, the breaking of glass or the crunch of a boot crushing something fragile. It might even been the breaking of a phone, as someone stepped on it after she'd carelessly left it in the foyer. She read the note quickly, wondering how much time she had left. His next victim was Carol Barner. Carol was selected at random, a crime of convenience that turned out to be very helpful. Carol was his neighbor, someone who worked from home as the pandemic raged. Carol liked to work late into the night, and her keyboard was so very loud. He had tried to be good, tried to lay low for a while as he settled into a new town, but the clack, clack, clacking was driving him mad. One night, as he watched 2 o'clock roll by with no reprieve, he took the continued noise as a sign from above. He broke into her apartment, and she never even noticed over the sound of her keyboard until it stopped tapping forever. In doing so, he discovered what it was she'd been working on, and found a way to finish his work without the hassle of finding more victims. He discovered the database that she'd been tapping away at, and after taking her premolars, he set to work. Her hands shook as she opened the next box, the knife threatening to cut her as it jittered over the adhesive. She could hear him as he moved through the house, being less than quiet as he yanked open doors and cabinets. He knew where she was. He had to, but it was all the thrill for him. He wanted her good and scared before he went about his business, and Emily had to still her hands as she read the note that lay atop the flyer for Catch a Killer. The flyer with the red stain distorting the K in killer and made it run like a wound. His next 8 victims were just everyday crime junkies, people who loved to research and speculate from the comfort of their home. He had a large pool to choose from, and it was easy to select those who wouldn't be missed or would take time to be discovered. Glenn Howell was a freelance coder with a passion for cold cases. Linda Merrill was a divorced housewife whose children had flown the nest, leaving her plenty of time to consume her true crime content. Courtney Powell and Linda Kane were roommates, and it was a wonder the 15 cats in their apartment hadn't got them before he did. John Boyd, Claire Keene, Reagan Summers, Casey Greer, they all took the bait and became true crime content all their own. Each kill swelled the legend of the Tooth Fairy. Each added another name to his tally, and each gave him another piece of the puzzle. As the police searched for him, looking for anything that could discover his identity, the Tooth Fairy found the last piece he needed, his final victim. The knob rattled, turning slowly as it hit the lock. Whoever was on the other side didn't kick, didn't yell, didn't fret. He knew they had all night. He knew she had nowhere to go, since there were no windows in her room, and there was no escape except through the door that he was now standing in front of. No one was going to come for her, and it was just the two of them until matters were resolved. He had to get inside anyway. Emily had all his tools. He had sent her everything he would need to make her another case file for some other true crime fan to speculate over. Would they wonder how she had been so easily caught? Would they question the validity of such a killer? Maybe the sheer idiocy of it all would help cement the legend of the Tooth Fairy into something told around campfires and under blankets as flashlights lit ghostly faces. Sometimes that was what really made the story, the idea that something like that could never happen to you. She opened the last box as he moved about her house like a fitful spirit, clearly savoring the moment. When she took the letter out, she yelped in surprise and let it fall to the floor. The last grisly totem fell to the carpet, clicking merrily as Emily watched it. It all made sense now. The name, the trophies, the order of the theft. He had needed them, needed to complete his masterpiece. He had to have a complete set, otherwise it wouldn't look right. She tore her eyes away from the grim spectacle and looked at the letter that was likely to tell her of his last victim. A victim she knew all too well. His last victim was Emily Colney. Emily fancied herself a true crime enthusiast. She petitioned multiple services since the beginning of the pandemic, but was never invited to join their groups. She wrote all of them in her application to catch a killer. And when it pinged on the database, the Tooth Fairy decided to make her dream come true and give her the true crime experience of a lifetime. Emily Colney, the perpetual shut-in on Hawthorne Street, would have the distinction of being the Tooth Fairy's last victim. After her, he would break his pattern and thus become harder to link to the crimes that would come after her. So thank you, Emily. Thank you for helping me complete my masterpiece. The door shuddered, and Emily dropped the note. It fluttered down to land on the grisly trophy on the floor, and she was forced to put her hand far too close to it as she picked up the note. It was a mishmash, a golem, a creation of love and hate, and it hurt her to look at. It seemed that Mary's denture plates had been put to good use, and the teeth within them were as different as they were misshapen. He had lovingly set them into the plastic, and they looked like an animal trap, just waiting to bite. The false teeth were missing only one set, and as the door splintered, Emily grabbed the hammer she'd received the day before and held it at the ready. A hand slipped through the hole in the door, grasping the lock with a smooth and practiced twist as he opened the door and let himself in. She saw him then, rising to his full height as he filled her doorway like a ghoul in a cast-off coat. He was massive, his head looking grotesquely small as it peeked down from between his huge shoulders. She felt the hammer slip from her hand as the smell of him wafted over her, the aroma of dirt, campfires, old chemicals, and ancient blood. She didn't start screaming until he smiled at her, his spitty, toothless mouth revealing empty gums. Gums waiting for what lay on the floor between them. Gums waiting for Emily to complete their reward for years of patience. I've been taking care of my grandma lately. She's been doing pretty bad, and she needs someone to help her almost 24/7. She's got kind of a bone disease or something. It's basically turning her bones into Swiss cheese. And I've had to carry her to the bathroom and room to room for the past couple of weeks. This might seem kind of tiresome to some people, but I'm glad to do it. My grandma and I have always been close. She basically raised me since my mother was never at home. If I can give back to her now, I consider it fair. She's been alone since I was in high school, and those 10 years have been the happiest I've ever seen her. She and Grandpa had been married for decades, 50 years before Grandpa just left, but they never seemed to get along. When I was young, Grandma would always come over and stay the night instead of having me come over there. Grandpa never came to our house. He mostly stayed close to home or went to work, but the few times I interacted with him, he seemed kind of off. Even as a kid, I didn't think he looked right. That might sound a little mean, but over time, he got paler and less coherent. He would mumble to himself with odd whispery things while he was watching TV. Grandma usually kept him in the bedroom with the TV on and the lights off. He disappeared suddenly when I was in the 9th grade, and it had been almost as much of a relief to me as for Grandma. So last week, when I slid her into bed and told her I was going grocery shopping the next day, so, she better get some sleep, she shook her head and looked away. "I doubt I will. I think this might be my last night in this bed." "Why, you eye in my bed? I'll swap you, but yours is a lot more comfortable than the one I'm in." "No, son," she cut me off, her voice thready and weak. "I think tonight might be the night I pass on." My eyes got a little big. "Do I need to call Miss Sam? If you think you're going to pass, then I should get the nurse out here, too." "I don't want them out here. You've been good to me, boy. I just want you here with me at the end. Besides, I need to tell you something. I need to confess my sins before I take them to heaven with me." "I mean, I can call Pastor Ferris over if you need to talk to someone about matters spiritual." "No, not Bobby Harris either. I want to confess to you. It's family business, and once I confess it to you, it'll be your burden to carry after I'm gone." I hesitated, thinking that I might not want this secret as I looked at Grandma's face. I had seen that face smile more than anything else, but the look she had now reminded me of something else I'd seen when I was young. It was something I hadn't noticed until I looked back through the lens of time, but Grandma had always seemed a little nervous whenever she stayed at our house. I caught her more than once checking the doors and windows, looking through the living room curtains as if expecting to see someone there. It always made me think that she was scared of someone. It was a look that always made me think a stranger was trying to get in so they could take me away. The truth, it seemed, was darker than that, though. I took a seat on the bed, willing to listen as little as I wanted to. "I'm here, Grandma. If you need to tell me something, then I'll listen." She nodded, looking out the window in her bedroom like someone might be there. "Your granddad didn't disappear," she said, wetting her lips with her wrinkled tongue. "I killed him." That was a shock, and my face must have said as much. She smiled, without much mirth. "Didn't think your old grandma was capable of something like that, huh?" "No, it's just surprising. You guys lived together for decades. I'm not sure why you would choose 10 years ago to..." It wasn't the first time," she said, her voice as thin as a spider web. "I killed your grandpa for the first time in 1973. 10 years ago was just the last time I had to kill him." I was confused, and I said as much, but Grandma only nodded. "Your grandpa, your real grandpa, died in 1972, but he didn't stay dead." She laid it all out, something that took us nearly into the next day, but she never stopped looking out the window as she spoke. I realize now she was looking for Grandpa. "When the call came, I was pregnant with your mother. Your grandpa had avoided the draft by attending college and had managed to avoid it again with a waiver from the government. He was an engineer working on bridges and sewer systems in D.C., and I was looking forward to having him home for a few weeks. He had promised to come home before the baby was born, and he was excited to meet his daughter. We had wanted children for years, and when we talked, you could hear the tears on the verge of coming out whenever he talked about our future. The phone call that day, however, seemed to be the end of that dream. They said he'd been killed in a car accident, and that it had been very quick. He had been driving to a job site when someone had run a red light and slammed into the driver's side door. They said he died instantly, hadn't suffered a bit, and I suppose that should have been a mercy. They wanted to bury him in the Capitol, but I was adamant that he be buried here. I wanted his daughter to see him, to know her father, but I couldn't have known how much she would know of him. A week later, before his body was even home, I heard someone in the kitchen late one night." Grandma's voice got low, the husk making my skin crawl as she stared through the little window into the past. "I must have looked aside as I came out with the baseball bat, but he never saw me coming. It was a man in military fatigues, eating a sandwich and sitting at my table like he owned the place. He hadn't bothered to turn on any of the lights, and the closer I got, the more I saw. He'd left a duffel bag on the floor beside him, and there was a glass of milk sweating on the table beside his plate. His fingers slipped into the white bread, and the lettuce and tomato looked wet against the roast beef poking out. I didn't challenge him. I didn't think he even knew I was there. When I hit him in the side of the head, he went down like a sack of potatoes. I killed him in that one hit. Hit him just right, I guess, but when I went to see who it was, I felt like I might have a heart attack. It was your granddad. He was laid out on the floor, bleeding from the ears, his blood staining his fatigues. I looked up the pins he had been wearing years after the fact and realized he'd been a corporal in the army. His paperwork said he was back on leave for the birth of his child. He was on 2 weeks of leave before he went back to Vietnam. I was confused. My husband had never been in the army, and as I sat there trying to figure out what to do, I decided to just bury him in the backyard. My husband was dead, and calling up the police to let them know that this man had broken in so we could eat a sandwich would only muddy the waters. So I buried him in the backyard. No easy feat for a woman 7 months pregnant. 3 days later, I was sitting in the living room folding laundry, just trying to get back to normal, when I heard a key in the front door. I heard someone coming in, set the bag down on the end table, and then I heard the last voice I ever expected to hear again. "Sorry I'm late, dear. There was something in the office I had to set up for tomorrow before coming home." It was your grandpa. dressed in a crisp white button-up and pressed suit pants. His tie was blue and white, something I'd never seen before, and it looked expensive. I'd never seen any of his clothes, and I was the one that did all the laundry. He spread his arms wide, waiting for a hug, but I couldn't move. I'd killed him. I'd killed him 3 nights ago. I watched him die, and as I backed away from him, I saw his face twist in confusion. It was painful, a look that hurt my heart. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "It's me. It's Wendell, your loving man." I was against the door frame, hyperventilating, clutching my stomach as your mother kicked inside me. She could sense my fear, feel my uncertainty, and she was responding in kind. He took a step towards me, and I curled into a ball as I tried to protect myself from whatever he meant to do. I expected him to try to attack me, to turn into a vengeful spirit and come after me, but instead he just wrapped his arms around me and hugged me close. "What's wrong, darling? Are you okay? Talk to me." It sounded just like him, and when I wrapped my arms around him, I realized it felt just like him too. The smell of his aftershave, the rasp of his 5 o'clock shadow on my cheek, the way his hair smelled like seltzer blue. It was all things that let me know it was him. When he hugged me to him, I gasped as I felt the lump on his inner arm where a birth defect had left a bone poking slightly out. It was him. It was your granddad, and I just leaned into him and sobbed as he helped me to my feet and took me to the bedroom. I checked the back of his head later that night when he slept, but there wasn't a mark or anything to lead me to believe that he had been the one I'd clobbered a few nights ago. I lived with that version of your grandpa for 6 months. He worked as a manager at a paper company, his degree in business instead of engineering, and he made a comfortable living for us. If I needed a reminder of the old times, however, I only had to look at the graduation photo hanging in the hallway. It was me and your grandpa in his cap and gown, and me in my best dress, smiling as his mom snapped a photo. I caught him looking at the picture sometimes, trying to rationalize it, before finally moving away to do whatever he'd been heading out to do. He was there for the birth of your mother, and I settled into a life of maternal bliss after that. Your grandfather was much the same as he'd always been, trading talk of bridges for talk of stocks and paper sales, but he was still the same man he'd always been. He loved your mother and me dearly. We never wanted for anything, but after a while, I suspected that something was off about him. It started with the sleep-talking. He would mumble ceaselessly from the time his eyes closed till the time they opened again. Your grandfather had always been a prolific snorer, ever since he was little, as his mother liked to say, but now he never seemed to breathe at all when he slept. He would mumble on and on about sewers and the war and stocks and paper and raising dogs and breeding horses and a million other things. Between your mother's nightly feedings and your grandfather's ceaseless muttering, I had become ragged. I couldn't sleep with all that yammering, and no matter where I slept, it always seemed to find me. I tolerated it until one night when I heard something familiar. I came awake to the sound of someone chewing and mumbling. "Where are they? Chew, chew, chew. I can't believe I had to make my own food. It's not enough that I chew, 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 went and fought them for her, but now I have to make my own sandwich." I had been sleeping on the couch, trying to get some sleep away from the muttering, and as I crept up the hall, listening to him mumble, and even the squeak of the door didn't arouse him from his nightmare. She couldn't even bother to wait for me, chew, 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 just because my bus was a little late. I'm a war hero, a soldier, and she can't even chew, chew. but he paused then before gasping harshly. "Ah, my head! What the hell is that? It's Maggie! Oh God, she's killed me! She's killed me! She's bashed my head in with a bat! I'm dead on the floor, dead right by my kitchen table. My blood's going everywhere. She's killed me! She—" The pillow was over his face before I could stop myself. I was just so ragged, so mentally fried that I knew he would tattle on me. He'd wake up and tell the police, and they'd find the body, and he'd be here alone with your mother, and who knew what would happen then? He wasn't her father, couldn't be her father, and he might hurt her or kill her, or... She looked back at me, and I could see her eyes swimming with tears. He only struggled a little, and then I had another body to bury. She was quiet for a moment, her eyes returning to the window, before continuing again. The next one was a car salesman, but he was less like your grandfather than the one before. I read something about how if you photocopy a photocopy, the quality degrades until it's almost unrecognizable. That's how this was. The next one sounded less like your grandfather than that, was paler than him, and seemed to get lost sometimes. I lived with this one for 2 years until he suddenly wandered into traffic outside our house. I told the police that this one was a cousin of my late husband, and that was why he looked so similar. The one after that bred horses, and when one of them threw him, I buried him at the edge of the range where he worked and went home expecting to find another one. I was becoming pretty good at losing husbands by then, and when the next one showed up, I hit him with a frying pan and left him in the backyard with the others. By the time your mother came home from school, there was a new one in the living room, reading the paper. Over the years, I'm ashamed to say I've experimented on how durable they are. I pushed one off the roof after asking him to fix something for me. He broke his neck, and I added him to the growing mass grave in my backyard. I poisoned one over the course of a year until he finally dropped dead one morning over his oatmeal. I pushed one off a mountain during a hike, only to return to the hotel and find a new one there waiting for us. The copies became paler and less coherent. Their voices became softer and less substantial. It got to the point that he couldn't hold a job. His mind was like a dementia patient, and I would look up sometimes and find him watching me through the window of wherever I was. Your mother had moved out of the house by then. A retirement check from somewhere showed up in the mailbox from a company that manufactured pipes. The money was good, the money kept us afloat, but I was tired of living with this pale ghost. Then, about 8 years ago, he walked out of the house one morning and never came back. In many ways, it was a blessing. I had become responsible for him. I had to take care of him and lead him around like a child. Suddenly, I was responsible for just me again. I kept cashing those checks until they stopped coming about a year ago, and I kept waiting for the day when he'd come back. I almost dreaded it because it would mean that he had died, and a new pale copy would take his place again. Grandma turned away from the window, locking eyes with me as the night slid by outside. Now it's your secret. It's your secret and your burden. The bodies in the back are still there. I checked periodically, and though they decompose, the bones remain. I don't know if this version of your grandfather will ever come back, but you will have to watch for him now. I've left everything here for you. The house, the accounts, everything. It's yours now, and I pray it brings you joy. She lay back then, and I could almost watch the life slipping out of her. By midnight, she was dead, and when I turned to get the phone, I saw what she had been waiting for. Gramps was paler than I remembered him, but he looked exactly the same otherwise. He waved at me as he stood there before backing away and leaving the way he had come. I went to the backyard and looked, but there was no one there, and no clue that anyone had been there in the first place. We buried Grandma in a plot next to Grandpa's original body. She lay peacefully there beside her husband. The caretaker tells me that someone comes to see her, though, leaving a single wildflower behind before moving on. I don't think he'll come back, but who's to say what the future might bring? In the meantime, I called the police to let them know about all the bodies in the backyard. The sheriff came and exhumed them, asking all kinds of questions that he didn't seem to believe the answers to. He had them tested, and to his surprise, all of them came back a match for my grandfather. Dental records, DNA, hair samples, it all comes back a match, and they were all left scratching their heads. They couldn't really charge my grandmother with anything. You can't put a dead person in prison after all, and they were left with a mystery for the ages. Either way, it's nice to have the bodies gone, and it was good that Grandma got to die at peace. As for Grandpa, I guess I'll just have to wait for the day when a new one shows up. Hopefully, I won't have a body of my own to bury when he does. I don't understand how it's come to this. I've been expelled from school. I've lost the few friends I had. My own parents won't even look at me now. And it's all because of her. Her. Even now I can't find it in myself to hate her. I love her, despite what she's done to me. I think I always will. For so many years, she's been my reason to get up in the morning. She's been the last thing I think about before I go to bed. Lisa, my soulmate. I was never what you'd call a popular kid. From kindergarten to high school, I was a fat, shy boy who just wanted to learn. I didn't want to cause trouble, and I certainly didn't want to get in any trouble. I mostly floated through life like a dandelion puff on a breeze. In my kindergarten class, she was this lovely creature with soft blonde hair and a face made for smiles. Even as a child, I knew she was beautiful. She found friends easily. Teachers loved her easy smiles and confident ways. Even the boys, who would still think girls were gross for many years, were forced to recognize her attraction. She was the belle of the ball, and our worlds could not have been more different. I was what you would call a fat child. My weight and desire for friendship made me the constant butt of any joke, and I was always the odd man out of any activity. Lisa sat in front of me. Alphabetically, our names are very close, and she became my secret obsession. I would sit behind her and breathe in the scent of her hair and bask in the glow of her beauty as she became my respite in this sea of horror. I would often pretend I was in her group of friends, privy to their secrets and a part of their oh-so enticing world. I would create conversations and lunch dates and feed my imagination with thoughts of our friendship. Our make-believe friendship was more real to me than my own life, and as the years went on, it became more of an obsession than a daydream. I drew pictures of our time together, wrote poems about her beauty, and filled books with our stories. I didn't have friends, not real friends at least. Lisa was all that I had. The trouble began in high school. Lisa was brilliant, always at the top of our class, but I outshone her most of the time when it came to matters academic. Lisa's one stumbling point was mathematics. She had never found math as easy as, say, English or biology, and it became a megrim for her. I would have offered to tutor her, but the gulf between us had only grown wider as we got older. She was a cheerleader and a member of the student council, and the secretary for the glee club. And I was just The fat boy who had grown into an overweight teenager who sat at chess club and debate team and wished I was close to her. When Mr. Sturgis asked us both to stay after class, I never dreamed he would assign me as her tutor. "You need help, Lisa, and Reggie is the best math student I have. I think, with Reggie's help, you can pass algebra." I could have kissed him. Lisa agreed, though hesitantly, and that afternoon we met in the library to begin her tutoring session. I could barely pay attention to what I was doing, as this goddess sat beside me and asked me, for help on what was really no big deal. I showed her the shortcuts, the workarounds, and the theories that would make it easier for her to succeed. She got a B on her next test, and I couldn't have been prouder. It wasn't long before our study sessions began leaving the library. She met me at the public library a few times. But one day, my greatest dream came true. As I left math class, she handed me a folded piece of paper that said to meet her after cheerleading practice. Then she just flipped her hair and smiled as she strode off on Goddess's legs and said, "See you then." The address was to her house. From then on, we always met at her house in the late afternoon. Her parents were surprisingly accepting of a teenage boy in their home, and I rapidly became as fond of them as I was of Lisa. Her father was an architect, and if I arrived before Lisa, he was always taking me into his study to show me his latest blueprints. Her mother was a lawyer, but after a lengthy lawsuit against the firm she had once been with, she had won enough money to stay at home and look after her family. Working from home as a legal consultant meant she often had time to bake, and her home was always full of the smells of bread or pies or culinary delights. The time I spent in Lisa's house was the best time of my life. As algebra became geometry and calculus, she always came back to her study buddy. I found easier ways to teach her what she needed to know, and she turned out to be a quick study once she found someone to speak her language. As we entered our senior year, I never quite asked why she still refused to acknowledge me in the hallway, or why her friends still picked on me. I was just happy to be with her, be around her, be a part of her world. One night, after helping her through a particularly difficult bit of calculus, she whooped with joy and turned to plant a kiss on my surprised lips. She broke the kiss in less than an instant, but it felt to me as though her lips touched mine for years. I could have floated home that night, and as I settled into bed, I knew what I had to do the next day. I would tell her how I felt, how I'd always felt, and ask her to accompany me to the upcoming spring dance. She liked me. We liked being around each other. What could go wrong? I went to her locker the next morning and found her there with only a single friend. Rebecca Jenner, the friend in question, sneered a little as I approached, and when Lisa turned, I somehow failed to notice the furtive look she kept casting around before she half-heartedly smiled at me. It's only in hindsight that I see my mistake. I approached her as an equal. I approached her in the open. I approached her in her element. I surprised her somewhere that she felt safe. I poured out my heart to her, right then and there, and by the end, a crowd had gathered around us. Some of them were snickering. Some of them were right out mocking me. But the mockery wasn't reserved for me alone this time. Looking back, I could already hear the whispered voices of Lisa's peers as they began formulating the gossip. "Oh, Lisa has a thing for pudgy nerds. Looks like Lisa would rather hold hands with pimple-faced dweebs than go out with football players. Sounds like little Lisa had a lot of fun at their study sessions." I didn't care at the time, though. I was pouring my heart out to a girl that I loved, and that was all that mattered. She was crying by the time I was done. Her face was beet red, and her tear-clouded eyes were scanning around for an escape. Finally, she pushed past me, sending me sprawling to the linoleum, and made a break through the crowd. I tried to go after her, but the crowd closed in on me, and the torrent of questions and accusations assaulted me. Where had I been with her? How long before Brad kicked my ass? Was I so stupid to think I was anything but a charity case? On and on and on, until finally I found an outlet and went tearing towards the boys' room. I hid there all through first period, and tried my best to keep my head down for the rest of the day. I didn't see Lisa that day. I didn't see her the next day either. but I heard the rumors about Lisa and her fat little boyfriend, Lisa and her study sessions with me, and all the other rumors about how Brad was looking for me so he could kick my ass up around my ears. Bradley Davies and I didn't have any classes together, luckily for me, but he still managed to find me. He and his friends came across me in the bathroom near the end of the second day and backed me up against the cold wall of the boys' room. He hit me a few times, Brad and Chuck and Gail, and as they took turns hitting me, Brad let me know the score. "You stay away from my girlfriend, you hear me? I didn't mind her keeping a little nerdy pet, so long as she still got to cheer and I still got to squeeze into her whenever I wanted to." This comment elicited some laughters and slaps on the back from his friends. "But that's over now. She's mine, and I'm not okay with your lost puppy act anymore. I see you around Lisa again, and you're dead, nerd." He punctuated this point by slamming his fist into my cheek, hard enough to knock my glasses into the sink where the lenses shattered against the porcelain. I lay on the bathroom floor and thought this was as low as I could get. How wrong I had been. When I came to school the next day, something had changed. I had been the target of constant teasing the last 2 days, but the reception I got this morning was icy. People whispered behind their hands, their faces angry, and all the anger seemed to be directed towards me. What had I done to deserve such scorn? I was the victim here, right? Brad had beaten the crap out of me, and Lisa had refused to even talk to me for 3 days. What could I possibly have done? The answer came in homeroom. A police officer was waiting to take me to the office where Lisa's parents, my parents, and the principal were waiting to talk to me. My confusion turned into fear at this, but confusion would make a lot of reappearances that day. The principal invited me to have a seat. My mother was crying, and my father's eyes bored into me like a power drill. I looked to Lisa's parents for some explanation, but they both made it very clear that they wanted nothing to do with me. Lisa had posted a message on Facebook this morning. She told all her friends about how I had forced myself on her during our study sessions and made her do things that I won't even mention here. My depravity knew no limits, and all the while I had convinced her parents that I was a fine young man and a model student. I had convinced everyone of this, she went on, but in reality I was a pervert and a rapist, and when I'd talk to her at school, talk to her like we were equals, she had finally found the strength to speak out about my depravity. She told her parents after that, and they had called my parents and let them know what their little boy had been up to. Someone had called the police then, and that's how we had come to the point we were at now. I won't bore you with the details. My parents and I became the town black spot for the next 3 months, as I took polygraph tests after psychological evaluation and protested my innocence at every turn. The police claimed they had a rape kit that tested positive for something, but the absence of any physical evidence was confronted by my obvious intellect. "Why would he be sloppy enough to leave evidence?" one officer asked, looking at me as though I was the lowest form of life. The case against me was eventually thrown out due to lack of evidence, but it hardly mattered. I had been accused of rape, and any bright future I might have had slipped out of my grip. It didn't matter how good my grades were, how high my scores were, or how many testimonials I had written by teachers who believed that I was innocent. No college wanted an accused rapist in their school, and I slumped slowly into depression. Why had she done this? Why had she ruined my life? All I had done was love her. All I had done was tell her how I felt, and all she had done was return my love with ruin. That is what brings us here. I'm standing in her bedroom now, looking over my handiwork. I had heard her parents would be out of town, and Lisa was going to have a party. I wasn't invited, of course. Since the incident, I haven't even been back to school, but I seem to remember where the house was and how breakable the back door window was. The rock made a lot of noise as it smashed through the glass, but no one was there to hear it. For rich, intellectual people, her parents certainly have a lot of faith in humanity. I had never seen a security panel or even a surveillance camera on the property, so getting in undetected was easy. I hid in the big walk-in closet that holds all her lovely clothes and waited for her to come home from school.
Her door swung open at 4:15, and imagine my surprise as she and Brad fell into her bed in a writhing pile of teenage spirit. Some would have seen this as an obstacle, but to me, it was just another opportunity. His back was to me, and I came up behind him and cut his throat. He garbled out something, but she didn't even seem to notice until he slipped right off her. She turned around and saw me, and that's when the begging started. The begging and the screaming. She kept shouting Brad's name, begging me not to, and I implored her to be as loud as she wanted. I wanted the neighbors to know what was going on. I wanted them to know how Brad had brutally murdered his girlfriend in a fit of teenage aggression before cutting his own throat out. It would be a poetic bit of melodrama, just like Romeo and Juliet. I'm pretty sure I snapped the knife off in her sternum after the 15th or 16th downward stab, but by then, she had stopped screaming. The knife's in my hand now. I was smart enough to wear gloves, and I already had my escape route planned out. You see, I may have never touched her, but that certainly didn't stop me from killing her.
There once was a man with ears, you see, in the dead of the night he'll come for thee. He'll drag you into the woods to scream, and there your bones he'll gnaw. Soon shall the Bunnyman come to take you away from your dad and mum. Soon shall the Bunnyman come, and your soul shall belong to him. Stop it, Catherine! I'd scream, but Catherine just cackled and sang it all the louder. I can still remember my sister's face because of that ghoulish smile she wore while she tormented me. We grew up in New Zealand, so the shanty was something old that we changed for our own purposes. Many of the kids sang it, but my sister was the first to adopt it into something different from the original. A few kids had added some creative lyrics to the original song, usually something about farty men or something, but Catherine had turned it into a song about the Bunnyman. She was forbidden from singing it at school. By our parents and teachers, and she took it as an excuse to sing it for me at every opportunity. It was usually sung low, under her breath, so my parents couldn't hear it, so she could deny it when I began crying about it. It was in poor taste anyway. The Bunnyman may have been an urban legend, but the man going around kidnapping children was very real. That summer, 13 children had gone missing in the city we lived in. All of them were from poor families like ours, who lived in tenement buildings, much like ours. They always disappeared in the middle of the night after being lured out of their houses, and there was always some sign left behind that tied them together. Whether it was spray painted on their door, the fence behind their house, or the sides of the building they lived in, the calling card was always left in plain white spray paint for the police to find. A white rabbit head in a white circle, the sign of the Bunnyman. My sister had started humming the little shanty after the 7th kid had gone missing. I had heard her in her room, working through the lyrics as we did homework. She would hum them to herself in a distracted way that people often do while they're trying to figure something out. As she scratched away at the math problem, she would argue with herself and make corrections to the grisly little shanty she was constructing. I would shudder to myself as I heard what she was writing, and I think I might have become her horrified little barometer. The more I shuddered, the more lyrics I heard that stayed in place. By the time school started again in August, her shanty had taken form, and she began her reign of terror. Catherine and I were 2 years apart. I had started 6th grade, and she had started 8th, and she seemed to delight in terrorizing the other girls in my class with her Bunnyman song. She would walk behind groups of students, humming the tune at first as they walked from class or to lunch. Then she would begin singing the words to herself, low at first, building volume, until a few of them started to hear what she was singing and become noticeably upset. Then she would run up behind the group, caterwauling the last verse as she sent them screaming and running in all directions. That's how she had earned herself a suspension from school and a grounding from our parents. That's why she was home that night, the night of December 15th, the night the Bunnyman did indeed come. We were both grounded that night, actually. My sister was grounded after being suspended from school for her Bunnyman shenanigans, but she didn't much care. She was happy to put off schoolwork and watch TV all day and suffer the wrath of our parents. I, however, was grounded for encouraging these antics by saying I had seen the Bunnyman. It wasn't a joke, though. I wasn't trying to encourage Catherine in her bad behavior. I had woken up for the 6th night in a row, hearing someone humming that shanty and going to the window to see who it was. I couldn't actually be hearing anyone, I realize now. Our loft was on the 5th floor, looking out on a vacant lot and the road behind the building. There was no way I should be able to hear anything. I could, though. I can clearly remember hearing that shanty, hummed in a gravelly baritone that sounded as though it were right outside the window. The first few times I heard it, I went to the window and looked out on the lot. In the moonlight, he was standing there, in the road, a man in a dingy gray rabbit costume, his eyes glowing yellow and his ears cocked almost jauntily. My parents would hear me screaming and come running into the room to see what was going on. They would find me on the floor, screaming and pointing out the window, always gibbering about the Bunnyman. After the 3rd night, I didn't even go to the window. I would lie in bed and sob as the shanty bore its way into my brain. I would sob and call for them, screaming about the damn Bunnyman, until finally, my father couldn't take it anymore. That's why both of us were grounded on the night in question, the night our parents went out. It was supposed to be a family night. We were supposed to go out and have a real family meal, see a movie, maybe get some ice cream. Instead, my father had been using it as a punishment for my sister after she'd gotten in trouble. We 3 would go out and have fun while she stayed home and did not. My mother, however, thought this was a little harsh, and she had been pleading with him to reconsider. This had made him a little short, and after being woken up by my screaming all week, he had reached his limit. He grounded me as well, thinking I was trying to egg my sister on with all this Bunnyman nonsense, and announced that he and my mother were going on a date instead. "We will be back at 10. You 2 are to be in bed by 8:30. If I come in and you're still awake, you will be severely punished." Then they left, and for a few hours we'd gotten along pretty well. Catherine made dinner, heating up some canned pasta in the microwave, and then we'd watch some TV as the sun set and the evening wore on. It wasn't until 8, when I got off the couch and started for bed, that she started in on her old ways. She asked what I was doing, and when I told her I was going to get ready for bed, she asked me why. "You heard, Dad. If we're still up when he gets here, we're going to get in trouble." "Pfft, probably just scared the Bunnyman will hear you awake and come get you." "I am not," I lied. "R2, you're in such a hurry to go to sleep, so the Bunnyman will come and take you away." She leaned towards me, grinning that awful grin. "Oh, there once was a man with ears, you see." I put my hands over my ears and started running away as she sang all the louder and chased me. "In the dead of the night, he'll come for thee." "Catherine, stop it," I sobbed. We were running up the hall, and as I wheeled into my room, I tried to slam the door and lock her out. She battered the door aside and bore down on me, grinning and singing as I cowered beneath the window. I was covering my head with my arms, sobbing uncontrollably as I tried to block her out. She stalked towards me, bellowing the song now and scritching her hands like claws as she walked towards me. "Soon shall the Bunnyman come to bring..." But she stopped suddenly, and as the silence stretched on, I opened my eyes and looked up to find her looking out the window as she loomed over me. She was staring out the window, transfixed by whatever she saw there, and this new game was almost scarier than the shanty. Her face held a look I was unused to seeing. She was startled, unsure of what she was looking at, but it also appeared that there was terror there. Something outside the window was really spooking her, and I scrambled up to peek under her arm so I could see too. It seemed I was peeking into one of my nightmares. Standing in the road, right under a streetlight, was a man in a tattered gray bunny costume. It wasn't like a Halloween costume, some of which looked like pajamas more than costume, but it was a full suit of coarse-looking gray fur. The fur was matted and dark in places, kinky and tangled like a stuffed animal that needs to be brushed. The head was obscured by a black hood, some kind of costume hood that just slid over the head, and the face was a flat black nothing as it stared at our building. No, not at our building, as it stared at at us. On top of the hood, someone had stapled a pair of thin, emaciated gray rabbit ears, one of which bent at an almost jaunty angle. He stood on the street and stared up at us, my sister and I frozen in terror at the sight of the legendary Bunnyman. All at once, I heard a gruff, tuneless humming from the street that sounded startlingly like Catherine's shanty. He had no words to go along with it. He only hummed and stared, and I think we both felt an almost magnetic desire to stare back at him. It was like the scene in a scary movie where the monster's out in the open, and you pray that none of the characters are stupid enough to go confront him. In your heart, though, you know that one of them is. Catherine, it appeared, was that one. I caught her by the arm as she turned from the window. She looked back at me, her face full of confused anger and unsure deliberation. She was clearly at odds with herself, and my sister was not someone who was used to being unsure of her actions. She was a brat, and she was a terror, but I had always kind of believed that everything she did was a calculated course of risk and reward. This was something else, though. This was her acting against her will. After all, she had sung about the Bunnyman coming for others, and now it appeared he had come for her instead. She jerked her hand away and left the room. When I heard the front door open and close, I moved back to the window, waiting for her to appear. The Bunnyman went right on humming, right on watching, as though he was trying to call me as well. I felt the pull. Really, I did, but my fear kept me rooted to the spot. I clutched the windowsill tightly, the paint chipping a little as my fingers gripped it, and I would find splinters under my nails the next day, though I didn't notice them at the time. Then, she appeared in the backyard, walking like a sleepwalker, and going to him as she vaulted the chain-link fence between the yards and the road. He reached for her, and now I could hear both of them humming that hateful song and staring up at me. It filled my head like a hive of bees, and I knelt my head against the glass as I prayed that it would stop. There would be no way I could resist if they both sang, and I could feel the pull as they tried to drag me out the door as well. After about 60 seconds of them humming and staring, she took his hand, and the two of them disappeared up the road. My parents came home 3 hours later to find me curled up on the floor of my bedroom, sobbing and gibbering as I rocked and mumbled about the Bunnyman. They searched the house, thinking that my sister had gone too far. She had finally scared me too much, and now she was going to have to answer for it. As my mother sat with me, trying to console me, my father tore up the house looking for Catherine. He clearly expected her to be hiding somewhere inside, probably running when she heard the front door open. When he couldn't find her inside, he went looking for her at her friends' houses. Their parents told him, often grumpily, that they hadn't seen Catherine, but they would call if they did. He got worried, going to look up and down the street for her, expecting her to be hidden somewhere in fear of retribution. All the while, Mom tried to calm me down and get a straight answer out of me. After about an hour, I started talking about the Bunnyman and how he had come to get us, how Catherine had left with him. She started to get angry, telling me that she was tired of hearing about the damn Bunnyman. However, when I refused to deviate from my story, she started to take me a little more seriously. The police were called, the neighborhood was searched, people were questioned, and the woods were combed for the next week and a half. No sign was ever found of my sister, or the Bunnyman. No sign was ever found of any of the children abducted by the Bunnyman that year. That was 15 years ago now. The Bunnyman took only one more child that year, a 7-year-old, on Christmas Eve, and then was never seen again. They never found the remains of any of the children he kidnapped, and no one was ever arrested in connection with the kidnappings. There was never any bunny suit found or a murder weapon discovered in the woods. Whoever was doing this had just stopped. I'm 27 now. My own daughter is 8. Her dad's not really in the picture, which leaves a lot of time for just us. I was getting ready for bed one night, Emily playing in her room before bedtime, when I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. The tune, a familiar tune that everyone in town knows, crept up the hallway. The tune wasn't what stopped me, though. It was the lyrics that made me shiver. The words she sang transported me back in time, and suddenly I was 12 years old again, watching my older sister creep towards me as she sang the same hateful words. However, the voice that sang them was childish, lilting the words with no more care than she would have had for any other nursery rhyme. There once was a man with ears, you see. In the dead of the night he'll come for thee. He'll drag you into the woods so green, and there your bones he'll gnaw. Soon shall the Bunnyman come to take you away from your dad and mum. Soon shall the Bunnyman come, and your soul shall belong to him. I peeked around the corner of the doorframe and saw her on the floor playing with blocks, oblivious to what she was singing. Emily, where did you hear that song? She got up and walked to her bed, giggling as she crawled under the covers. From the funny lady. What funny lady? I asked, bending to tuck her in, but finding my hands incapable. She comes and sings at night sometimes, after you go to sleep. I'll wake you up so you can hear her next time. When I go to the window, she's standing on the street. She has ears on top of her hood, Mommy. Isn't that silly? I told her it was very silly, but I didn't feel like laughing in the least bit. Emily's in my bed now, sleeping soundly as I pin this warning to anyone whose children have heard this song too. I'm afraid it's not an urban legend. It's not a hoax. The Bunnyman is real, and it seems that he's not alone anymore. He's coming for our children again, and I, for one, don't mean to lose my daughter to this creep or his children. As I lay here writing, I can almost hear it on the breeze, as if someone's singing it outside my window. Emily is stirring in her sleep. It appears it may not just have been in my head. I fear it may already be too late.